All right, let's get started then. I want to first of all by saying thank you all for hanging out with us today. Welcome to Watercolor Basics Landscape Painting. My name is Matthew, and I'll be assisted by my chat facilitator, Caitlin. Can you say hi to everyone?
Hello.
Today, we're going to be covering about going out and painting from the neighborhood and the basics of watercolor painting. So let's get started. The purpose of this is to get you out of the house in a safe manner, to go around the neighborhood and take a look at what's around you and relax and kind of enjoy painting. To get started, we're going to gather up some tools that are needed for painting. Now, you won't need all of these that I've listed here. These are all just the basics, things that you would want to bring with you. There's no specific brand either that you have to get as well, but for travel, I do recommend dry brick watercolors and travel variants of watercolor sets, as they're easier to carry and don't get as messy. So to start, we have brushes, basic tool that applies watercolor pigment to the paper. Sponges, also another tool you can use. It gives you cool textures when you want to apply to the painting. An easel, also not necessary, but I usually like it if I'm bringing a larger piece of paper to work with. Helps keep everything nice and organized. Tape for keeping the paper down also can be used as stenciling and breaking off areas in your painting. Obviously, water and paint. I mean, you can't paint with watercolor without the two. And lastly, paper. Now, paper is a whole animal in and of itself when it comes to painting, the intricacies of which I'm not really going to get into on, but basically there are two kinds you need to worry about: hot press paper and cold press paper. The difference being hot press is a smooth textured paper that can be used in a more, like, the application process, the water goes all over the paper very easily. It doesn't get stuck in any divots or anything like that. Whereas with cold press, the paper is like a vellum texture, has a rough kind of feel to it, and it adds, the texture that you might want in your painting. Again, paper, it's all up to you. Now that you have all the tools, we're going to talk a little bit about composition, which is the manner in which such parts are combined or related. It's basically how you want to set up the shot in a piece. I like to think of illustrations and paintings as shots from a movie. Like I'm the cinematographer going out and trying to get the best shot for the film. Composition can really make or break a painting. Good paintings tend to follow a specific pattern. As you can see here in my PowerPoint, we have a picture of a spiral. Most good compositions in paintings tend to follow a spiral shape or a spiral kind of theorem. That principle of the spiral, or the rule of thirds as it's sometimes called, is referred to as the Fibonacci Principle. And it's basic building blocks for good illustration. If you go to the Renaissance paintings, all of them have this mathematical tool applied to them. Now that you have an idea of what you want your piece to look like, then that's when we get to the actual application process of painting. And there are many few ways you can go about applying paint to the page. Here's a few of them that I think kind of come up the most often. Wet on dry. Wet on dry refers to having a wet brush with lots of pigment on it, applying it to a dry piece of paper. Wet on wet is the wet brush on paper that has water over top of it, so it's already wet. You can get cool effects with this where it'll kind of seep the pigment out and do interesting tones that we'll get to when we actually get to the demo. Dry brush is when you have a brush that has pigment on it, but it's basically at the end where you need to go re-dip into your water, but you can get cool effects from that, so people will tend to use dry brush for more rough effects in their paintings. Usually I like to use it for bushes, tall grass, things like that. Splattering is also a nice one where you take a stiff brush, load it with pigment, and kind of scrape across the top of your thumb, which allows pigment to kind of fly off the brush and scatter across the page, giving a cool splatter effect. Again, cool if you're trying to do water splash effects, cool for like, you know, if you have a splatter scene, things like that. But after knowing the basics, there are some fun tricks that you can do that can really enhance the watercolor painting. I've got a few of them here listed. There's not all of them. I'm going to go in depth on each individual one as we go through the piece here. To start, we've got salt, we've got oil and alcohol, which both have the same effect on watercolor. We have wax, then we have stencils and tape. As I mentioned earlier, the tape being able to block off large areas. And lastly, masking fluid. Masking fluid is a bit more expensive, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. Salt is an interesting component. It is a sponge of sorts that soaks up water, and when it soaks up the water that has pigment in it, it takes the pigment with it and leaves behind whatever was underneath the page. And since table salt and all varieties of salt have unique shapes to them, they're very crystal-like, when it's absorbing the water, it leaves behind an interesting design in there that you can use sparingly or just quite a bit, and it gives you a really cool effect. Now, with the varieties of salt you can use, table salt, pretzel salt, any salt that you have just lying around the house works really well for this. I personally use this, again, for water effects. Looking at the top of the water, you can see how water tends to look as our picture is over on the right here. It has a lot of sectioned off areas that aren't very, pristine. They're very random and wild. Now, oil and alcohol actually work the exact opposite way of salt. Instead of absorbing water and pigment, it pushes it away. As you all know, water does not mix well with alcohol or oil. So when water color is hit by the oil as you apply it, it moves it away, gives it this kind of weird bubble effect. You can apply it with either a cotton swab or an eyedropper and get various cool effects. Again, I prefer to use this for more bubbly shapes, more underwater effects, things like that. A very helpful tool. Now, wax, unlike the previous tools we were using, wax doesn't soak up the water, doesn't push it away. It kind of just resists it. Like water doesn't really, touch it, doesn't react to it anyway. Usually, I use wax resistances for blocking off specific areas that I just don't want water to get under. There's plenty of other things you can do with it. There's a lot of different tools and tricks you can use, but personally, I don't use wax that often. What I actually use a lot of is stencils and tape, because in my work, I prefer a bit more of a rough look, because stencils and tape, while they're great at blocking off specific areas and blocking out interesting, unique shapes, they tend to let water seep through and they can tear the paper. So if you're not really looking for that rough look, I would not recommend stencils and tape. However, since I want that look, stencils and tape are great for me. If you want a much more clean look, however, and you're trying to mask off areas, masking fluid is the tool for you. It's very good about getting those specific tiny details that you're looking for in a very clean styling as well. Basically what a masking fluid is a special fluid that dries into a kind of rubber covering over your painting, and absolutely no water will get in. It is great for blocking out specific areas you want to change the color later, or if you just want it to be completely white. Luckily, it is removable after use. However, as you can see over on our image here, they're using an eraser to get rid of the shavings that are left over. You want to be very careful whenever you're removing masking fluid, as if it's not properly dried or if it's just, you know, a large area is being covered with the masking fluid, you want to be careful because when you're trying to remove it, it will bring up the paper with it if it's just not carefully removed. One of those things that is pretty frustrating is when you have a really nice painting and you laid out the masking fluid and you're ready to take it off, and then all of a sudden it takes the painting away with it, and you're just, you know, left sad. But before we dive into our demo here, I want to see if there's any questions in chat before we get started. Okay, so since we're gonna get started here, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and we're gonna switch on over to our demo. Okay, we're good? Okay. All right. So what we have here is my usual work layout for whenever I'm doing a painting. I also, before we did this program, I got some photos printed out to do reference. You don't have to go out and do this outside. You can go out, take photos, and then kind of pick and choose which ones you think have the best composition, and then work from home inside, either or. So whenever, for this particular piece, I'm gonna do a wet on wet application. So I wanna get this paper wet here. Now I've also taped down this piece because I wanna make sure that none of the paint goes outside of my frame here. So we got that. A little bit of blue here. So it's really helpful. Go off to the side here to kind of see what you have. So I'm gonna start here. As you can see, the way that the paint is being applied on the wet surface, it's kind of starting to streak a little. That's because it's trying to get into the divots of the paper, since we talked about that earlier with cold press, that it adds a little texture to it. Now, some of you might be wondering, why am I starting all over the page like this? And the reason for that is because we want to set up our background first. Whenever you're painting with watercolor or painting in general, I always, at least for me, I always like to start from the background with our lighter colors and then work our way to the foreground with all of our darker colors. Now that's just for me though. Some of y'all might have different approaches to it, and that's okay too. You can see I'm just kind of dabbing it around here too. Again, I want a little bit of texture here and there. All right, then we're gonna grab some other colors here. I'm gonna grab, let's see what I want to grab here. This color is a bit gray, but I don't really want it to be gray. So I'm gonna grab maybe a purple. Let's go with a purple. One of the other things too is it doesn't matter what colors you choose here. Again, this is your painting. I'm going to start kind of blocking out all of the darker areas. Let's see here. Yeah, we'll grab this little violet here, and we're going to go in over top. Yeah, there we go. That looks much better. So we're starting to get a little darker here because we do have, you see in our photo, a lot of trees down here. Again, we want to make sure that there's this little aura kind of going around. So when you have a painting, it doesn't really matter what the colors you choose are, as long as there's something that kind of tells a story and helps get the composition across. So as you can see, my composition is very much an L shape here. So we want to make that L shape kind of apparent. All right. Now that we've gotten that background figured out, let me do this to kind of dab it down a bit. We want it to be a little bit drier when we get to the next layer. There we go. So I used a large brush there to kind of, since we're going in a lot of different directions, I'm going to get a little bit smaller. Not too small though. Probably some good around. Yeah, we'll go with this one right here. It's definitely important if you're working on larger pieces or pieces in general, that you have a variety of different brushes that you can tool from. A different brush is good for a different job. You want to have the right tool for the right job. Some middle ground here. See, we've got some more trees here. It's a little darker. And we're just trying to get the shape here. Too much other than that. There. Then we can go in a little bit more detail. Let's grab a smaller brush. I'm going to grab a dark color here. I'm going to grab a darker brown. And then we're going to go in here and start grabbing some of these little branches here. What is my favorite watercolor brand? I'm personally a fan of Koi because they're a good cheap brand to start with. Afterwards, you would probably want to get like Winsor and Newton. Those ones are also very good. Basically, though, you can do pretty much anything with any kind of brand. Don't go off starting and buying with like the most expensive one, especially if you're just starting out. I prefer getting like cheapo brand stuff if I'm just experimenting or testing out. I know that a lot of people are always like, will buy like a really nice sketchbook or buy really nice materials and then just be afraid to use them because they're like, you know, oh no, what if I mess up? So again, I think that's why it's good to buy the cheapo brands, at least when you're starting out. So let's get back to you guys over here. So yeah, we're also going to start grabbing different colors here and there to kind of show that we have different branches happening here. Normally, I would actually probably use a little bit of salt in this area, but salt takes a little longer to dry and a little longer to absorb the way I would want it to. So we're just gonna let it be. I'm actually gonna grab a bit of red here. As you can see that if I'm looking in this picture here, the way that the light's hitting our branches here, we have a bit of red coming through because this was about, you know, mid-afternoon. There's also a bit of green here too. So let's grab some of that here as well. Got a little bit of green in this corner here. As you can see, we're just kind of trying to get some basic shapes here. In fact, since we're going to do a bit more on the basic shapes, I'm going to grab a larger brush again. Grab another dark color here. Grab some browns, a little bit of black. Kind of start really pushing our shapes. Don't be afraid to be bold with your strokes as well. With watercolor, it's not really all about exact one-to-one recreations of things that you're seeing. It's also kind of about just, you know, capturing that essence of it. Get some more brown here. Get some red too. The color. There we go. Also this building here. Kind of in the middle ground here. Start trying to showcase what's in the scene a bit more. So we're now getting a little bit more. All right. Dry out a bit. And then go in and grab some more. There we go. Now we're starting to see this building here. One of the things too, I like to talk about when it comes to making shadows and things like that. One of the things I really don't like doing whenever I use watercolor, ink, marker, things like that, is I don't like using grays or black whenever I try to shade things. I usually like to use blue, purple, things of that nature, because using dark colors tends to muddy the piece a lot, and I don't really like muddy paintings too much. So we're gonna grab some more color here as well. Yeah, there we go. Okay. I'm gonna go over here, kind of get some of that. I don't like that too much, so I'm gonna dab just a bit. Okay. All right. Let's grab a bit more blue. I'm noticing that it's a little bit bare here, so I'm gonna grab some more blue here and just kind of bring it in. Watercolor is a pretty forgiving medium. You can always paint over top after something dries. What I like to do actually, whenever a piece is ready to dry, things like that, is I actually have brought some of my preferred colored pencils that I like to do over top, as well as some of these paint markers that I use for after things are said and done. Also, just forgot, have another ink brush whenever I need to do the really dark areas. So we're gonna start kind of dabbing down here a bit. That way when we put these colored pencils on, they don't run everywhere, because these are actually water soluble ones. They're pretty good too. Derwent does pretty good colored pencils as well, if you're looking for a good colored pencil. We'll start here. Good coverage there. You can grab brush. Oh, it kind of dissolves into it. You know, I'm kind of using circular motions on it. That's because since I had scribbled this way, it's in order to get it to fully dissolve, for the most part, you kind of want to do a circle motion over top of it to kind of really blend it in as best you can. well. Brown. Yeah, it's still wet, so it's making this interesting texture as you go over top of it. This kind of stuff's really fun. When you get all these extra little tools, things like that, that go top of it. Grab, as I talked about earlier, I usually prefer to grab purples or indigos, things like that. There we go. Do my shadows. And also, don't be afraid to use your finger to blend things as well. This is all kind of about bringing about that inner child too. Use whatever you want to blend. It's your painting. There we go. I might grab some other pigment here too, that might help. There we go, yeah. There we go. Now it's getting nice and shaded. And now we can move on to some more of the trees. And for that, I'm actually going to break my rule and grab a black colored pencil here to try to go over top. Grab some of the more prominent branches that we're seeing here, since they are going to take up most of this piece. Oh, it's bark. Reading chat. Well, actually looks really nice too. It's kind of one of those we call them happy little accidents. I've been wanting to say that a whole entire stream, chat. What's nice too, though, is what's a good contrast is you can still see that the color underneath is still showing through that we had put down. So like those little greens, those reds, those purples that we had used earlier, all still showing up just nicely. So we're gonna actually grab a little bit more of that purple too. I'm gonna go over here, just make sure it looks the way I want it to. It's a little dark. We can work with that. We'll grab that because this is gonna be our shadow here. Because looking at my reference photo, this area is definitely one of the darker spots. And we're going to try our best to keep adding shadow to the piece. It's a nice contrast. All right. Let's grab that bark again. We have this really big tree that we've been leaving for the last because that's in the foreground. So usually, again, foreground stuff I usually leave for last. So we're going to grab that bark colored pencil once more. Kind of go up top. And we're just sketching. Doesn't need to be perfect. Again, if you ever look at a tree, it's never perfectly straight. It's never fully symmetrical. There's a lot of things going on with it that you can just kind of make up as you go. We're gonna do our best to try to push this tree to the foreground. By that, what we're gonna do is we're gonna focus, if you look at this photo here, we're gonna focus on the main branches as they kind of go out from there. And that's what really needs to be seen whenever you're working on a tree or anything like that. All these little tiny ones, they don't really need to be, perfectly one-to-one created. You can do that with just a little bit of texture. Just imply that they're there. So I'm noticing it's getting a little dry towards the top, so we're going to grab just a little bit of water, kind of re-wet that down so we get that texture we want. Also, what's nice about having this tape border here is I can actually go off the edge here with the tree without having to worry about it messing with the full composition of the piece I'm going for. There we go. Oh, someone seems to have asked about the Watercolor Steam Kit. Oh, just the fact that we have one? Oh, yeah. We do actually have a Watercolor Steam Kit, and it does, in fact, include pencils kind of like this. They have watercolor pencils inside of them, a little tiny watercolor set that you can actually check out for yourself too. If you're interested in trying out watercolor, but not sure where to start, it does have that available here at the library for you to check out. 21 days, good stuff, plenty of time. I'm gonna grab another green here because we do have a little bit of a bush in the front that I'm noticing now. That's a bit too, let's grab some brown too to mix with that. So we don't want it to be too, there we go. That's a much more natural green that you would see. It's a little dark, so we're gonna dab it. Lighten it up a bit. Mixing colors does take a lot of practice to get down to a good science of it. As you can see, I'm kind of just going and grabbing just random colors as it looks like. But basically, since I've done this for so long, it's like, okay, I know I need a little bit of black, a little bit of brown, a little bit of green, and this already kind of yellow concoction that I have to make nice, good, deep forest, natural green that we want. But again, that's one of those things that just takes a little time. And if you're willing to put in the effort, you can get about just as, good at doing the color mixing as this is. So we're gonna actually, I'm seeing some signs here as well, so we're gonna try to draw those in. Got one kind of right here. And another one kind of over here. And we have a few here as well. Wow. Didn't realize how many signs there were over in this area. There we go. Now we've got this part is getting a little closer to being done. I'm going to grab a smaller brush for this area. We're going to grab that. We're going to grab a little bit of this kind of almost orange brown, a little bit of this dark brown here. And I'm going to grab a little bit of blue too, since this is really orange. For those of you who don't know, the reason I grabbed blue to kind of mute this tone here is because blue is the exact opposite color of orange. One of the things that comes with color mixing is learning your opposites, your complementary colors, as well as the colors that go well with them too. Complementary is what we call those. So in order to mute an orange kind of tone, you use a blue. To mute a green kind of tone, you'll use a red. To mute a purple tone, you'll use a yellow, so on and so forth. Okay. Grab another dark color here. We've got some windows here. Let's paint those on like that. Also noticing we have a little bit of some telephone poles, which I personally like telephone poles a lot. A lot of people think they're kind of ugly. I think they're really cool looking. So I'm going to have some in mine. Okay. Now, lastly, if there is any bit of like a light source or things like that, I usually like to grab a whiteout pen like this. Side here, you can see here, squeeze it out a bit, a little bit of white comes out, and you can do for basic whiteout stuff. This particular image isn't too well lit. It's much more, dull, middle of the day thing, but we're still going to use some white anyway, just to showcase what you can do with it. Again, since it's still wet, I can also go in with my finger, kind of blend it into it. Not really what I want, but we'll go with it for now. I can probably just go back over with this. It's more of a way to show you that there's a thing you can do. This is that one. It's good to check what color you're about to use. There we go. Now, since this piece is a bit darker, and I really want to showcase this particular tree, I may go over here and add a little bit of white to where the light's coming from. That way it kind of pokes it out here just a bit, but I also want to make it a little darker. So that's when I'm going to add this ink brush pen. Now, these brush pens are pretty easy to come by too. You can find them at pretty much any local art store. I know a bookstore by the name of Kinokuniya has these brushes as well that you can get, and they have a lovely, a lot of assortment of refills. Yeah, we just want to make sure that this is much more prominent, so we're going to use a lot more black here on this. I'm also noticing there's a little tree up here, actually, closer to us than this building is. So I'm going to push this building back a bit by adding another tree here with the black ink. Kind of also acts as a little gateway. Okay. Now, lastly, I'm personally fine with how this piece looks. Most watercolor stuff I do when it's like going out into the neighborhood, going out, doing watercolor from real life, it's very quick. It's very much just loose, trying to get an idea of the actual environment you're in. So things like this that look very rough and are just basically a composition shot, more of a test than anything, I usually think this is okay and this will be done enough for me at least. For you, could be you want to put a bit more things. You might wait for it to dry, add in some other stuff, maybe go in with some more detail with the pencils, maybe go into some more detail with brushes and things like that. Is that an actual question? Yeah. Oh, so brushes that I'm using, Princeton is a pretty decent brand. They're relatively cheap. There are brushes in general are a super diverse thing. Like types of brushes though, like are you talking about like flat brushes like this? Are we talking round brushes like that? What do we specifically mean? Are we talking about brands or what? The generic kind of brushes. Generic kinds of brushes? Okay. Whenever I work with watercolor, I prefer Princeton brand. in terms of what they have, because so brushes have different kind of hair on them. There is a synthetic hair, and then there's hair that comes from actual animals. The ones that come from actual animals tend to be more expensive. So if you're just starting out, the synthetic brushes are fine. Princeton has synthetic brushes like that. They also have ones that are made from the real fur. There's also Winsor & Newton brand. Again, they make really good watercolors, inks, and brushes. Now, but the Winsor & Newton is the more high-end quality brand. And that brand, again, as I was saying, if you're just starting out, don't sweat that kind of, don't put all that money into that when you're just starting out. Kind of work your way up to it. You'll find that the Winsor & Newton Series 7 brushes are the ones that everyone wants in the watercolor ink community, but those ones are highly expensive and I don't recommend them to start off with. I would recommend, again, Princeton is a good brand. I think this was a Princeton one as well. Yeah, this is a Princeton one. But these kinds of brushes are really good. Having a wide brush like this is really great for if you work largely in large pieces for watercolor. This one's good for, any size. This one's good for tiny pieces and details. They all kind of have different uses. Does that answer the question? Okay, great. So yeah, for me though, I would consider this piece done. Since it's just a sketch and it's just to me to figure out what I'm looking for in a piece or for a setting, for a background. I'd probably go, if I was going to do this on a larger piece later, I would probably do a lot more, thinking and more development in the composition. But for what I'm doing right now, this is perfect for a sketch. Normally I sign pieces, but this is just a sketch, so I'm not signing it. I think that is good. We're going to move back over to our presentation real quick, because I do have some resources that are available for you as well, for those of you just starting out, that we have here in the library. On top of that Steam Kit that we talked about earlier, there are some video resources online as well as some good books. All right. So lastly, for the resources, books, we have actually all of these books that are listed here in our library. You can actually check them out, put them on hold today if you'd like. Feel free to write them down. We're going to be on the slide for just a little bit longer. The other thing I would recommend going to is the Winsor & Newton website. The company that makes the brushes, the paints, all that good stuff, they have their own website that's dedicated to tutorial videos, how-tos, all that great stuff. And also, since you have library cards with Plano, you can actually access Linda courses free of charge. They actually have quite a plethora of painting classes that you can go to. The ones I've listed here are specifically just for landscape, light, things like that. Definitely something worth your time if you're interested in getting better at the craft, or if you just want to do watercolor and learn new tips and tricks, things like that. But with all that, that is it. We now are open to Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat now and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Do I have a favorite artist? Man, I actually have quite a few artists I like a lot. It kind of really depends on what I'm looking for when it comes to art. When it's like for more watercolor, ink, fantastical work, I'm a big fan of Yoshitaka Amano. If Caitlin could type that in the chat, that'd be helpful, because that name is hard to spell. Or is it? I don't know. He's really good when it comes to very like dense, fanciful illustrations. I highly recommend looking at his work. He's been around quite a while, and he's a very prolific artist, so it's definitely worth looking at. If you're also looking for good watercolor artists, NC Wyeth is really good too. He is a very good illustrator. He's really good about painting scenery, things like that. Really good about painting like with very muted colors and very mundane colors, but he paints these very gorgeous characters, landscapes, things like that. Yes, I would say if you're just beginning to use watercolor, things around your house are definitely good, like plants. Yeah, if you have like any gardens in the backyard or any, your neighbors have nice shrubbery or things like that, plants like that are good to get photos of and take photos and, work from reference from there. Buildings, I don't know if that's like as much of that one's a bit more intermediate in my opinion, just because when you do a building, you get kind of trapped in the idea that it needs to be fully detailed. And whereas with plants, animals, people, you can really simplify them. Whereas buildings, they tend to not work very well in a simplistic idea unless you're doing a real loose sketch, and you can, continue to be loose whenever you're working in buildings. Oh, of course. There you go. We'll just stay on that for the rest of the webinar. Do you ever use acrylics? I do. You can acrylics are nice because they're water soluble as well. I actually use acrylic inks, so they're slightly different, but basically an acrylic ink is a watered down acrylic paint for all nuances of it. But yeah, I work with them a lot. I actually like them a bit more than regular watercolor, only because they're a bit more opaque. So you can pretty much put down a lot more in layers for your piece because they're basically opaque over opaque over opaque rather than, translucent over translucent over translucent. Oh, if you do have any other questions though too, this is going to be recorded so that it will be on YouTube later. If you have want to go over this webinar again, you can watch it on our YouTube channel. It'll be there available for you as well.